I'm going to get started because one announcement that there's always one that gets left behind. And that is, if you're a member of the board, please stick around after we're done here, because we need to have a really quick board meeting. It won't take but just a second, but it is vital. So if you are a member of the board, just stick with us here for just a little bit after we're done, and we will have our quick board meeting that's required for the month of July. Now, as I begin this morning, I'd like to speak to anybody that might be watching this message. If you've come to us watching this message online, if you come to us by way of our website, ChristianDisciples.org, and you are watching us by clicking on virtual worship, I'd like to speak to you personally, and that is down below the video screen. You can like us on Facebook. You can follow us on Twitter. Just above that's a spot where there's something we can be praying for you for. Click on that button and let us know, because we'd be honored to be praying for you. One final thing to you, and that is just over here to the right of the video screen, the second icon down. If you will click on that button, you will find the sermon notes that come in our morning bulletins. If you happen to be watching this message on YouTube, you can find those sermon notes in the description of this video. So good morning again for the fourth or fifth time. I like saying good morning. I'm glad that you're here. Because today we are starting a new three-part series that's going to take us through the end of the month here in July. We're going to call I'm Sorry. And in this series, we're going to look at a few different perspectives on restoration and on reconciliation that more times than not require some form of forgiveness. And so we're going to take this idea of forgiveness that honestly is so important in our Christian lives, right? We're going to take this idea of forgiveness and we're going to look at it from a few different perspectives in the Bible. And what we're going to see over these next few Sundays is that the idea of reconciliation, and I put that definition there in your notes there, it's also on the screen here in just a second. We're going to look at this idea of reconciliation, right? Whether that reconciliation comes through restoration or through forgiveness, or both, that it brings a sense of wholeness to our lives. It brings a sense of rightness that is absolutely necessary for each of us to live successful Christian lives. So let me begin today by telling you about Mustafa. Mustafa is a truck driver. Now, in the aftermath of a tsunami that hit southeastern Asia several years ago, for some time Mustafa had no idea where his 5-year-old daughter, Rena, might be. When he was finally reunited with her, he held her in his arms. He was overwhelmed by emotion. He fell to his knees and he cried out his daughter's name over and over again. By the grace of God, I knew that you were alive. I just knew it. Mustafa screamed at the reunification, "My precious little one, I did not give up. I kept looking." The account of this reunion comes from the Save the Children website. Mustafa was on his way to Midian, miles away from Bandit Akh, which was his home, where that devastating tsunami had hit. And when he returned home, he had discovered that his wife and his daughter were missing. Now, unfortunately, Rena's mother was swept away in the tsunami. She was never located. And while she was separated from her family, Rena was registered with the Save the Children website and was being cared for by a woman named Muta in Bandiaf. The day before Rena was reunited with her father, Save the Children released the names of 72 children whom they had registered as separated or unaccompanied, and these children were being held at 20 various camps. Rena's name was on one of the lists posted at the camps, and it was read on the radio and posted to this Save the Children website. As the father and daughter were departed, as they left the place after being reunited, Rena waved at Muta and kissed her hand. Mustafa cradled Rena Augustina and kissed his daughter's cheek. He then led her out to the sunshine. They were together again. The war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, soldiers leave for a tour of duty, and Those whom have not returned now number in the thousands. No wonder then that those who do return are greeted with joy and tears and smiles of relief. Children separated at birth from their birth parents for one reason or another, and then later put up for adoption, they often seek to be together again with the mother that gave them birth. We can understand the very human need for reconciliation, whatever the cause of the initial breakup. To be reconciled, to be returned to a sense of wholeness and of fullness, it is a desire that is innate in each and every one of us. And this morning, I would like for us to examine a story from Genesis that, as it unfolds, we see it is both full of poignancy and of tragedy. It's the story of Joseph, the son of Jacob, who is the grandson of Abraham. Now, a violent conflict had separated Joseph from his brothers. The story of Joseph begins with his brothers conspiring to kill him, and then throwing him into a pit, and then selling him into slavery. We read in verse 28 of chapter 37 of Genesis, "So when the Ishmaelites, who were Midianite traders, came by, Joseph's brothers pulled him out of the cistern," that pit, "and sold him there for 20 pieces of silver. And the traders took him to Egypt." After this breakup, Joseph is taken down into Egypt, where he becomes the successful manager in the house of an Egyptian officer. Unfortunately, the officer's wife attempts to seduce Joseph, and her unsatisfied lust results in a jail term for Joseph. But the Bible tells us in chapter 39 of Genesis, verse 21, there's a bit of good news for Joseph. Scripture says that the Lord was with Joseph in prison and showed him his faithful love. So he becomes the favorite of the chief jailer, and later, as the story continues to unfold through the book of Genesis, he rises to the position of second in command to the Pharaoh himself, gaining control over all of the land as governor. And it is in this position of power that Joseph encounters his brothers again. And their painful breakup results in a divine reunion. Our story this morning, friends, is the very essence of this idea of reconciliation. So, let's put this story in perspective a bit. Color in a few of the details here that, for those of you that may not be as familiar as perhaps others with this story, if you're one of those people, there's no shame in that, right? That's why we're here together. So Canaan, right, that's Joseph's homeland, it's the land of his family, had been hit by a severe famine. And so the brothers of Joseph, they leave Canaan and they travel down to Egypt to buy some grain. They meet with the governor there, not recognizing that he is their brother, actually Joseph, and they ask him for assistance. And Joseph toys with them a little bit. He even throws them in prison for a while. But he ends up giving them the grain that they so desperately need. Then Joseph reveals himself, saying in the 45th chapter of Genesis, verses 4 and 5, now you can imagine this scene here, okay, if you're following along here. The brothers, they think Joseph is dead. They certainly did not expect him to be an officer of the Pharaoh. They cannot believe what they're seeing and they're hearing. Scripture says, "Please come closer," he said to them. So they came closer. And he said again, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery in Egypt." You can imagine their jaws hit the floor. "Don't be upset." Don't be upset, he continues. "And don't be angry with yourselves for selling me into this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. Now, if what I have just told you of this story is all you happen to know about the saga of Joseph in Genesis, I can imagine that you might very well find it hard to put yourself in Joseph's sandals and be so forgiven. And if you happen to know the whole story and all of the details and the wrongs that were committed against Joseph, you would certainly not be to blame if you could not find it in your heart to be so loving. But Joseph sees that God used this ugly breakup amongst brothers for his purpose. If you need a good example of God's ways being higher than our ways, or His purposes being different than our desires, this is it. You see, God had put Joseph into a position where he could actually help his family survive a deadly famine. The brothers might have intended evil for Joseph. I'm sure they did. Intended evil for him when they sold him into slavery, but God intended it for good. Verse 7 of our story here tells us, "So it was not you who sent me here, but God," explains Joseph. God had made him the ruler over all of the land of Egypt so that he could preserve a remnant of his family on earth. The original breakup may have been painful. I'm sure that it was painful, but it wasn't all bad. For in the restoration, in the reconciliation, in the forgiveness, we see God's plan for wholeness in our lives. This remarkable story reminds us that even when we've experienced awful separation, it is still possible in our lives to move toward awesome reconciliation. Evil is turned to good, and loss is transformed into gain. Events like this can help us gain a fresh understanding after we think that we have experienced failure, and a new purpose after a time of pain. This, friends, is a story of estrangement and reconciliation. And it's an account that unfortunately reflects some of the pain that each one of us feels from time to time, each one of us. But because we so often focus on our desires, in these times of trial, in these times of pain, often we find ourselves focusing on our own circumstances, focusing on our own desires, instead of God's will, and instead of God's plan. And when we do that, it's natural for us as humans. But the resentment that follows, that we so humanly allow to overtake us, often will get in the way of God's wholeness for us through His reconciliation. Our resentment so often gets in the place of God's reconciliation. And as a result, we miss out on the wholeness that God desires for each one of us. So, how can we be reconcilers and not resenters? Well, I think that there are three lessons that we can take away from this story. I think there are three things that we can focus on in our own lives so that we can de-emphasize our own resentments and encourage God's reconciliation. We can begin to experience the fullness of God's wholeness He intends for each one of us. I think when we put these three factors into play, let's look at them quickly. Number one, extend an invitation. Notice that Joseph says to his brothers in verse 45, come closer to me. We've been wrong. And it is so hard for us to make the first move, isn't it? Well, it might not be hard when we want to repay offense for offense, eye for an eye, trespass for trespass, right? We can go right to being the first to respond. But to reconcile, that can be a little bit tougher. But we need to remember that the power of reconciliation is to restore harmony and to restore trust between those who have been offended, and sometimes that's us. If we want to unite, if we want to reunite, it may begin with our invitation to the offender to come close. This is not an invitation to overlook. Don't misunderstand. I'm not inviting you to overlook transgressions. I'm not asking you to dismiss what happened. It's simply a mechanism to close the gap, to begin to see each other as human beings, sometimes each of us tortured by emotion and by forces way beyond our control. Personal space is an issue, is it not? Most Americans are uncomfortable within that 3-foot bubble, right? When that's invaded, we don't like people getting in our face. We often ask people, get out of my face, meaning that other people should leave us alone, right? The Middle Eastern culture, they have no qualms about this 3-foot bubble. If you were to visit the marketplaces in Iraq or in the West Bank, you'll see people haggling each other face to face, nose to nose. Come closer is an invitation to begin a process whereby, instead of saying, get out of my face, we're actually saying, get in my face, get in my space. Because we cannot begin the journey to reconciliation when we're so far apart. With you sitting on the other side of the room and me on the other. Come closer. Let's talk. And once that process has begun, then we can begin to work towards forgiveness. Joseph says, and don't be angry for selling yourself to me to this place. Let go of the offender's involvement in your life and let God deal with those who have caused the estrangement. Because you see, friends, forgiveness is not about keeping a score. Forgiveness is not something we do for another person and then we talk about the concept in depth a couple of weeks later. Forgiveness, friends, is something that we do for ourselves. Forgiveness is not for others' peace. Forgiveness is for our own peace. Forgiveness is not an action, it's an attitude. And when we understand that forgiveness is not about heroic deeds, but about a heroic attitude, then forgiveness, then reconciliation begins to make perfect sense. You can count actions, but you can't count attitudes, because Jesus does not keep a forgiveness score. It would have been easy for Joseph to have kept his brothers at arm's length instead of inviting him to get in his face. It would have been easy for Joseph to not forgive. Instead, Joseph says, don't be angry with yourselves. The second thing that can help us with reconciliation, number 2, in your notes there, and I think this is vastly important. In these times of trespass, in these times of wrong, in these times of offense, we need to look for God's fingerprints. See, Joseph continues the story, explaining to his brothers, continuing from verse 5. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. This famine that has ravaged the land for 2 years will last 5 more years, and there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. God has sent me ahead of you to keep you and your families alive and to preserve many survivors. So it was God who sent me here, not you. And He is the one who made me an advisor to Pharaoh, the manager of his entire palace and the governor of all Egypt. Now this is not to say when evil or distress comes into our lives that God is always the author of the mess. But it is to suggest that in all of our circumstances, every single one of our circumstances, if we look, we can find God at work. Finally, the third tip for being a reconciler and not a resenter, number 3, we can choose to be a part of the solution. Joseph tells his brothers in verse 11, I will take care of you there, for there are still 5 years of famine ahead of us. Otherwise, you, your household, and all of your animals will starve. Joseph was not about to just forgive and then write them off, right? I forgive you and then blow them off. He enters fully into their circumstance with them. And he takes action to help them come closer, to help them find wholeness again. Aristophanes was this Greek playwright in ancient Athens in Greece, about 300 or 400 BC. He's often referred to, Aristophanes, as the father of comedy, his playwright. His powers of ridicule in his plays, in his works, was feared and acknowledged by influential contemporaries such as Plato, whom believed that one of his plays, Aristophanes, actually led to the trial and the eventual death of Socrates. In one of Aristophanes' comedies, an aged farmer staggers onto the stage. He's weeping. Enemy soldiers had invaded his land, had terrorized his family, killed both of his oxen. His family was pitifully hungry. But when he was asked what he wanted, instead of asking for something to eat or something to drink, the farmer says, what I want more than anything else is for a drop of peace to be poured into my eyes. Likewise, Joseph. Likewise, us. If we can have the courage to extend an invitation for reconciliation, we can look for God's hand in our circumstances. And when we do, we can be encouraged to be a part of the solution. We too, in the midst of hurt, in the midst of loss, in the midst of pain, just like the farmer of Aristophanes, have peace poured into our eyes. If we want to be together again with those who have been so long apart, we see here in Joseph's behavior a model that will help us let that happen. Reconciliation, the desire